I'd like to welcome you to our online presentation today with Expedition Trips. We're here to talk about polar bears of Churchill with polar bear experts. And here to introduce you to this topic and tell you a little bit more about these exciting journeys that are planned is the founder and president of Expedition Trips, Ashton Palmer. Welcome, Ashton.
Thank you, Lee, and welcome everyone to this special webinar presentation today. I'm really happy that you're here and appreciate that you've taken the time to learn a little bit more about one of my favorite destinations and certainly one of my favorite animals, the polar bear. I have been helping people plan trips of a lifetime to some of the most spectacular destinations on the planet for almost the last 15 years, and prior to that, actually led expeditions throughout the world, especially in the polar regions of Antarctica and the Arctic. And today I'm excited to be talking about the polar bear capital of the world, Churchill, up in northern Canada. And one way that you can visit the polar bears of Canada, and it's actually one of the most straightforward destinations on the planet that you can reach to see these animals and have the experience. So once again, thank you for being here, and I'm thrilled to have Eric Rock, the head naturalist with Natural Habitat Adventures, joining me, who has led many, many trips to Churchill, and also is just a true expert in the region. And I'm proud today to be showcasing our partners, Natural Habitat Adventures, who've been operating trips to this region for almost 30 years, in addition to many other countries around the world. And certainly of all the different partners that we work with and the great trips that are out there, I hold Natural Habitat in a very high regard, and their trips are great. So I don't want to take up too much more time. Eric, I'd like to hand over to you, and once again, thank you for being here and taking the time to talk about these wonderful trips up in Churchill.
Thank you, Ashton. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. It's nice to be here today with everybody. I'd like to welcome you. I feel very fortunate to be here to talk to you about polar bears and the expedition trips to experience these amazing Arctic animals. So the first slide is kind of a little fun way to kind of share how anthropomorphic these animals can be and how dynamic they can be. We'll also show off the relationship between expedition trips and Natural Habitat Adventures. I've got a couple of things I'd like to talk to you about today. Let's see, line out the webinar a little bit so you give you an idea of our direction. I can come back to it then at any point. I'm going to talk about, first off, start off with an introduction to polar bears, how and where they live, and then we'll come around to the polar bear experience offered by Churchill, Manitoba, and going to Churchill to see polar bears and how that fits into the bigger picture. And then I'll follow up with insights into the travel experiences offered by expedition trips to Churchill to spend time in experiencing these polar bears right there on the ground. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And I think I'm going to hope that everybody can see my cursor, my little arrow cone up there. I think to understand polar bears, first we have to look at where they're found. Now, I have a couple of maps in here. Some of them I think will help add to the experience of understanding why Churchill is so important, and we'll go a little bit closer to Churchill. Right now, we're looking at the Earth from above. So we've got the geographical North Pole here, and if we were to imagine, and it's not so important for this, the magnetic North Pole would just be off the coast of Baffin Island over here. So we're looking down at the Earth. You can see Alaska over here, rolling across northern Canada, through northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, and then across northern Russia, Siberia, and back around to Alaska. And what this map shows you are the 19 different subpopulations of polar bears associated with these northern polar regions. Basically, that's the only place you ever really find polar bears, is associated with this northern polar ecosystem. Now, if you take a look, the white line here is the Arctic Circle. Now, even though we can go to different places around the globe with the potential to see polar bears, say if you're on a cruise through the Northwest Passage here, you might have a chance of picking up an observation or viewing a polar bear from the deck of that ship, or maybe on one of the little forays ashore. One of the places where people go is this little group of islands here known as Svalbard or Spitsbergen. A cruise from, say, Norway out to Spitsbergen would be a great way to possibly see them out in the ice. And you do see polar bears there. It can be a little bit iffy because you're dealing with, currents and where the ice goes, fog, things like that. You could even go up to the coast of, say, Alaska, maybe go up to Barrow, possibly have a chance of seeing a polar bear along this coastline there in the summertime or late fall. If you're adventurous enough, maybe even over into northern Russia. But the population we're going to talk about today is down here. We're going to go further south, down into the Hudson Bay. If you look, here's where the Arctic Circle is. I'll point that out again a little bit later. We're going down here to what WH stands for Western Hudson Bay population. And that's the population of bears we experience while we're in the Churchill area. And right here where my cursor's at, right by the end of the W, is where Churchill sits, right on the shoreline of the Hudson Bay. I'll go to a more conventional map for other reasons here shortly. Just wanted to point that out, that you only find polar bears in the northern hemisphere associated with the northern polar region, and that's going to come into play when we talk about how they make a living. So let's go ahead and move on. And here's just a map of Canada to give you an idea. Alaska's sitting off here. We've got the Great Lakes across the Midwest. And orient you with where we're going to be going from. Winnipeg, Manitoba, here where my cursor is, right in the middle of the map, kind of roughly the geographical center of North America. And again, Churchill sits right up here on this edge. The reason I like this map, it can be a little bit confusing with all the different colors for the ecotones or ecoregions or zones here, but I just wanted to show you that there's a little phenomenon that happens along the shore of the Hudson Bay where you get Arctic conditions much further south than what you'd normally expect. Even though the Arctic Circle is way up here, we get Arctic environments way down south along the shore of the Hudson Bay. Pretty important when we start talking and understanding why Churchill is so important to polar bears and why it's such a good area to see polar bears. So let's go ahead and move on. And here, a little bit more conventional map to give people an idea of where they sit, where Churchill sits here on the western side of Hudson Bay relative to Winnipeg. Now, let me go back just one more, just so you can see that. So here we are, Winnipeg, Churchill, looking at the province of Manitoba. And then let's go ahead and look over here at this map. Now, roughly the distance from Winnipeg, if you fly a direct line from Winnipeg to Churchill, it's about a little over 600, maybe 650 miles, a direct flight, depending on the wind conditions and maybe which route they give you for a flight plan. There's also one other way to get to Churchill. It isn't by driving. You can only drive part of the way. If you're adventurous, you can drive to Thompson or possibly Gillam and get on the rail, which leads you to Churchill. But one way is to get on a train outside of Winnipeg, which takes you out into Saskatchewan and then leads you back up into Manitoba and eventually ending up in Churchill. So there are no roads that actually go to Churchill, but there is a railroad. In the fall, it's not as reliable because there's a lot of freight trains that run this line, take sidings. Oftentimes the train's delayed. So autumn isn't the easiest time to go to Churchill on the train, so we tend to fly, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. By the way, the distance and time roughly is about 1,000 miles by rail, and then the time minimum is 36 hours, so you're on the train for 2 nights if you're to do that. But just to lay it out, where we're at in Churchill, fairly remote, but it's lucky enough it does have a full-service airport as well as a rail line to supply, and that helps make things a little bit easier to travel to and also for infrastructure for tourism. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about Churchill. Here you can see the rail line. This is an late summer photograph of Churchill from the air. You can see the railroad cars lined up here as they're coming in to feed the grain port. Grain is shipped out in the ice-free months to markets all over the world. So the town of Churchill here, the hamlet I like to refer to as Churchill, is home to maybe about between 600 and 700 souls on any given time. Sometimes during the polar bear season, with more people coming into work seasonally, the population blooms a little bit, and then during the middle of the winter when the grain ports shut down and very little is happening with shipping, things quiet down a little bit. But what's important about this photo, you can see here, we sit right along the western shore of the Hudson Bay. That's this large body of water over here. And then coming in on this side is the Churchill River. And that's what makes for a safe harbor to bring in those ships to load up with grain. But it's also going to become key when we start talking about why polar bears gather here. So just a little picture from the air to show you what the town of Churchill is. It's about 5 blocks long by about 2.5 blocks wide, depending on where you're at any given time. So not very big, but it does have an amazing infrastructure for travel to that destination with the hotels, the restaurants that are there, and ready to take care of travelers when they come into the area. So let's go ahead and explore a little bit further. As we do this, I like to go back a little bit in time and present things from a different perspective. Churchill has been important to people probably since about the close of the last ice age, the Pleistocene Ice Age. And it looks like there have been people living in the Churchill area for at least 3,500 years, maybe as many as 4,000 years. Nobody knows for sure because those early people did not leave much behind. The pre-Dorset people, the Thule cultures. There are artifacts in the area and give us a little bit of a window on how they might have made a living off the rich resources of that Hudson Bay, that large body of water that sits right along the shore there at Churchill. So this is an Inukshuk. It's a stone marker. It was used by the Inuit people and still is used by Inuit people today as maybe helping them find directions in a featureless landscape or point them to maybe a campsite or a cache that they might have made at a previous journey. So it's kind of become the symbol of the North. And so I like to open up the slideshow and talking about Churchill with that and the history of peopling in that area, mainly because Churchill's been an important place because of the wealth of resources coming from this Arctic body of water that's fairly far south. And we're going to explore that and how that pertains to polar bears as well. So let's go ahead. Also, not only indigenous people of the area, whether you're talking about the early pre-Dorset and Thule people, later came the Athabascan family groups like the Dene. You also had Inuit people making their way down the coastline. So this area around Churchill was a traditional meeting point for those people. But later on, with the opening up of North American by Europeans, it became a very popular, very important focal point for Europeans as well, whether it be for the search for the Northwest Passage, or opening up North America to trade, primarily through the Hudson Bay Company. Churchill was important in all those. And you still see derelicts and remains from the early history of European exploration in the Churchill area as well. This is just an old dory from one of those early vessels that was washed up on the shore across the river from Churchill. So to give you an idea that not only was it important to early Americans, like the Dene, the Cree, the Inuit people, but it was also important to Europeans when they made their way into North America as well. And some of these people still call Churchill home today. Some people still live a traditional subsistence lifestyle along its shorelines, taking what they need from the wealth of resources, the Hudson Bay, whether it's hunting for caribou along the northern coastline or hunting out on the frozen ocean in the wintertime. This is a local Churchillian man who uses the frozen Hudson Bay to exercise his dogs in the wintertime. This is giving an idea of what the ice would look like right around Churchill in the middle of winter, maybe January or February. So that's going to be important for understanding the resources for these particular animals. This is why most people come to Churchill now today. Churchill has a couple of different seasons. They have a summer birding and wildflower season, which is phenomenal because it's what we call the accessible Arctic. It's so close to where most people live, a relatively short series of flights can get you to Churchill. There's also winter Northern Lights season there as well, but a summer beluga season. But polar bears are the main reason people visit Churchill today, this particular animal. If you're of scientific mind, you know the polar bear is Ursus maritimus, the Latin referring to the bear of the sea because they make their living off the frozen ocean. If you were Cree or Dene, your name for this bear would be Wapusk. If you're Inuit, their name for the Inuit name for the polar bear is Nanook. You've probably heard that word used a bit. That's actually their name for this wandering nomadic white bear of the north, the polar bear. But we often refer to it as just the polar bear today. And that's the animal that brings most people to Churchill. Now, why is Churchill such a good place to see polar bears? That's a big part of what this talk is about, and kind of blending that into with the polar bear biology. Here's just a gathering of bears hanging out in the Churchill area in the autumn time. Now, it's important to realize that polar bears can be seen any time of the year in the Churchill area. Most of the time, they're out on that frozen body of water. Anytime there's ice on the bay, they'd be better off out on that ice. But your chances of seeing them are best when the ice is off the bay and the bears are starting to concentrate around Churchill. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. So normally polar bears are out making their living out on a frozen ocean. Why a frozen ocean? Well, that's their platform. That's their habitat for making use of the resources out there on that frozen bay. So what is that resource that they're hunting for? Primarily seals. Now, this is a young harp seal. There aren't harp seals in the Hudson Bay. I borrowed this photograph from my wife, who's a wonderful photographer, and leads trips to see harp seals on occasion out in the Magdalene Islands. But it's roughly about the same size as, say, a ring seal pup living out on the frozen Hudson Bay. The Hudson Bay, especially around the Churchill area, has three main species of seals. We have the ring seal, the harbor seal, and, of course, on occasion, a bearded seal, which make that part of the Hudson Bay home. Now, that's a primary prey or food source for these wandering nomadic bears. So when there's ice on the bay, their best bet is to be out there making a living. They have to use that ice to get to the seals. And so by using a couple different techniques, whether it's stalking or waiting at breathing holes for a chance the seals to come up and bask or maybe come up for a breath of air, if a good secretive bear, a good stalking bear will be close by, and if they're lucky, they'll be able to grab that seal, and that's where they gain their sustenance. If they don't have the ice, though, they have a very difficult time catching seals. Seals have millions of years of adaptations for making a living in an ocean environment. If you've ever been lucky enough to see them in the ocean, maybe one surfaced near a boat and then shot away from you, or maybe you were snorkeling and you saw one in the water or diving, you saw one in the water at an aquarium or a marine park, you may have seen them. They're like torpedoes underwater. Bears only have maybe a couple 100,000 years of adaptations going back to the ocean, or I should say polar bears in general only have a couple 100 years of going back to the ocean. So they're not quite as good in open water. They might get lucky on occasion and catch them in open water, but really their forte, their way of making a living is catching them from the frozen water on that platform of sea ice. So in open water, not very good. So bears are going to rely on a frozen body of water. So when the seals come up to take a breath or bask or give birth to their pups, that's when they're much more susceptible to predation by Ursus maritimus, or the polar bear here. So let's go ahead and talk about that in Hudson Bay and why that's important. Now I just put this slide up. In fact, if I was stuck on one slide and I had to do this talk from one slide, I'd be this one right here, mainly because it allows me to talk about a lot of different aspects to what happens in the season of the polar bear in the Hudson Bay area. Well, Hudson Bay is fairly far north, but remember I mentioned the Arctic Circle is way up here. It goes right across the top of the Hudson Bay. But because this is cold Arctic water coming in from the north and it circulates around, it influences the landscape around it. So we actually have Arctic environments much further south than what you would expect. Along with that, in wintertime, it's cold enough in this area. You know, we're far north of Chicago, Winnipeg, that area. We all know how cold those Midwestern states can be in the wintertime. If you could imagine going even further north where Arctic conditions prevail, the Hudson Bay is in a very deep body of water. It tends to freeze over, fairly constant too. And when I say it freezes over, not absolutely completely, but pretty much completely. If you were patient enough, you could probably spend your time walking your way across the Hudson Bay, avoiding open water. But for the most part, for bears, there's good ice out there to be hunting seals. So wintertime, which usually begins in Hudson Bay when it starts freezing up in mid to late November, freezes over and doesn't break up again until, say, maybe mid-June to late June sometime, when most of the ice breaks up and washes ashore. Now, in the springtime, when that ice starts to break up, the prevailing winds coming out of the northwest here push that ice down to the south. And who do you think comes ashore on that ice that's broken up over the Hudson Bay? All those polar bears that are spread out over the bay making a living. To give you an idea, in this western Hudson Bay region here, I showed you on that earlier map of all the different 19 subpopulations. If you were to look at this area here, there's roughly, probably just a little under 1,000 bears roughly that inhabit this area. So numbers tend to vary a little bit, but right now the most consistent numbers for this region of the Hudson Bay is just under 1,000 bears make this area home. And they wash ashore, and they come ashore down here along the southeastern coast from Churchill. They go through the summer. They don't have any real reliable access to ice where they can hunt seals, so they go into what we call, some ecologists refer to as a walking hibernation, a forced foodless period, basically, where they try to take it easy. It's kind of like you and I. If you're laid off from work, you want to spread your resources out as long as you can. Well, the same for the bears here. Their work is out on the Hudson Bay making a living hunting seals. When summertime comes and they're washed ashore, they come ashore with that ice that's breaking up. They're going to go in conservation mode. And then as things start to cool off, there's a tendency for these bears to make their way north to Churchill and gathered here on this little cape. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go, but here's Cape Churchill. Now, why Cape Churchill? Well, if you take a look, we've got this Hudson Bay is saltwater. It's a large bay on the Arctic Ocean washing in. So saltwater tends to freeze at cooler temperatures than fresh water. Later on, I'll show you some pictures of some of the ponds and lakes around Churchill that are frozen much earlier than what the Hudson Bay does. So we've got some large rivers. We've got the Nelson River here, the Churchill River, the Seal River, the Caribou River, the Hayes. They're all large rivers draining water from as far west as the Rocky Mountains. They bring a lot of fresh water into the system, and it actually raises the freezing point. So the first ice to really form on the Hudson Bay begins down here in the south around Churchill. There'll be ice gathering up here in the north, but what's important to these bears down here is the ice that begins right here. So over time, bears are very good with tradition. If their moms taught them a good place to be for the first ice to form is Churchill, those cubs will come back, those cubs will bring their cubs, and eventually this tradition begins where bears gather along the Cape. And so because this freshwater influence, the first ice to start forming here in mid to late November is usually right around the Churchill area. So the bears, once they have ice, it's kind of like opening up the gates and saying, hey, you have a job again, and get back to work. So the bears have learned, if you want to start to work earlier, be in the Cape Churchill area for that first ice to form, and then you're some of the first bears out there to start hunting again, start hunting your food, which are seals and other marine mammals like that. So that's why Churchill is very, very important to that western Hudson Bay population, because this is where the first ice forms, their first real opportunity after going, say, July, August, September, October, to get back out on the ice and start hunting again. So it's very, very important there. And then they spread themselves out over this part of the bay, start making a living until the next time spring comes around and midsummer and things start breaking up and they get washed ashore again. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that area. Churchill just sits here on this little peninsula between Hudson Bay and the Churchill River. You can see the old site for the Fort Churchill, where most of the polar bear viewing occurs out here on the the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, right next to one of Canada's newest national parks, Wrapup National Park. There's that name, Wrapup, the Inuit word, or sorry, the Cree word for polar bear. This national park was dedicated primarily to protect one of the highest concentrations of denning polar bears in the world that we know of. And so right adjacent to that is the polar bear viewing area. It's been set aside as part of the Churchill Wildlife Management Area. Now the Wildlife Management Area actually extends much further south and around, kind of like a buffer to Wrapup National Park, but this is the area I usually have access to when we start talking about the polar rovers and getting out onto the tundra to see them. You can see quite a bit of lakes and ponds and stuff out here, and those should show up in the photographs as well. But to give you an idea, it's probably about 11, 12 miles from the town of Churchill out to where we actually do the polar bear viewing. Now, that doesn't mean polar bears don't come into town, and we'll talk about that on this particular webinar today as well. So let's go ahead and explore a little bit more. Anywhere I go, I like to talk about the people of those areas. And the people of the North are no exception, and people of Churchill especially. Very adaptive people, very good at knowing how to use their resources to their best. While realizing they had this concentration of polar bears there, tourism started up, and they needed a way to get people out onto the tundra, into this ecosystem, where people could not only comfortably view polar bears, but how about safely view polar bears in their area while they're waiting to head out onto the ice once it forms. Here's a picture of what we use primarily, a polar rover, which you can see we fit about, well, it's a fairly large vehicle. We don't fill it to capacity. We usually, at capacity, we probably run only 14 people in here, and it has at least twice as much room than that. So everybody has a window, everybody has their own seat and room for their camera gear, binoculars, day pack, things like that. So you can see, it takes you out on the tundra. It's very safe. It's also comfortable. We'll move down. You can see a picture of my wife working as a guide as well, and she's making sure people are well fed and taken care of. Inside, if you're rolling along and you don't want the windows open, you don't want to be on the back deck, you can sit comfortably, take off your jacket, throw over the seat. So it's an extremely comfortable way to get out there on the tundra and enjoy these animals right in their environment. So, I can tell you I've had 15 years of polar bear viewing experience, and I haven't experienced anything as comfortable with these vehicles. The old days, they weren't anywhere near as spacious and near as comfortable. So it's kind of made me a little bit softer over the years, but you know what? I do not mind. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this. So over the years of polar bear viewing, these polar bears have been just making a living out there on the ice. They come ashore, and they're still in energy conservation mode. They've learned over time, as long as people behave respectfully and the vehicles observe the trails, stay on the trails, don't pursue them when they don't want to be pursued on the tundra, the bears just relax and enjoy the experience as well. Here's an idea of what a polar bear might come up and explore. Polar rover, like in a situation. So they've learned to just kind of let things roll. They're in waiting mode and waiting for the ice to form. So it's a kind of a balance that's come around as the bears become tolerant of people, as long as people are respectful, and you can view them, observe them, watch their behavior, and photograph from the comfort of these polar rovers. You can imagine just trying to get out there and walk around on the ground. Not only would safety be a major issue, but also your comfort as well. And here, if you get cold, you move inside, you warm right up. and come back out on deck, take more pictures if you want to, or open up the windows and photograph from inside. Quite comfortable. So now, this is not a polar bear, and you wonder why in the world did Eric leave a picture of a grizzly bear in this slideshow? Well, I like to present the idea that polar bears are completely different bears than black bears and brown bears, the other bears we have in North America. They've evolved for different reasons. I started out my career leading bear viewing trips in Alaska, guiding in Denali, Katmai National Park, and I've always enjoyed the company of bears, especially brown bears. It was only about 15 years ago that I was asked to go to Churchill for the first time and observe polar bears and lead trips to photograph and observe polar bears. I didn't realize how long this relationship was going to be and how much I was going to appreciate this relationship with polar bears. So brown bears, on the other hand, evolved in a way like black bears to live on primarily a vegetarian diet. We say they're carnivores, but they're really omnivorous, which means they can live on plant material, whether it's berries or roots, stems, leaves, you name it. Brown bears can live on all that. Much different diet. Same with black bears. But where polar bears live, it's a different story. Polar bears head into a place that's so harsh it's really hard for even humans to survive there with modern technology. And it can be unforgiving to those that are even prepared in the worst case scenario. But for polar bears to head out into this white winter world of frozen ocean in times when temperatures can easily be minus 50 Fahrenheit, that's not counting, wind chill. I've been out on the frozen Hudson Bay at minus 50 without wind chill. To give you an idea. These animals head right out into it, and that's where they're the most at home. Completely different living for these guys. And they can't live on a vegetarian diet or an omnivorous diet. It's just not there. In the fall, you might see them chew on a branch or a twig, or you might see them eat some kelp that's washed up on the beach, or a few berries they might find now and then. But the energy demand for their world is just too high for them to live off an omnivorous diet like that. These guys need to be hunters, and they're consummate traveling hunters, and that's how they make their living. So they head right out on the ice, and they're pretty much walking on a treadmill. They're always looking for food. When they do have food, they feed heavily, store up as much fat as possible, and then move on to the next possible opportunity for resources like seal hunt, or possibly maybe a dead animal that surfaces in the ice floe, or possibly washes ashore. So they're constantly moving on this moving body of ice out on the frozen Hudson Bay. Traveling, they use their senses a lot like brown bears and grizzly bears do, but even more so. In their white, featureless world, it's going to come down to using those highly attuned senses, primarily a sense of smell, to make their living out there in that world. That's their money maker. That, along with their adaptations for large canines for hunting and killing, but also large, you can take a look at the feet or the paws down here in the bottom, large flat paws, great for spreading their weight out over soft snow or ice, but also work very well for swimming, big paddles for swimming, just swimming along as they swim from one ice floe to the next, looking for seals to hunt. Now, in the Churchill area, I mentioned about how summer comes around, late spring, summer, the ice breaks up, washes ashore, the bears come ashore, and they're hanging out waiting for that opportunity to start making a living again. Well, things start changing. The flowers that have come in the summertime have now gone to seed. This is Arctic cotton going to seed. The birds that were there for the summer start migrating south. Things become cooler. Polar bears are very well adapted for cool weather, so cool weather means they start moving again. They start making their way back to the Churchill area, because remember, they were taught if a good cub learned from its mom, paid attention to its mom, the best place to be when things start to cool off is Churchill. They start making their way. Bears are arriving every single day, and usually by early October, there's bears waiting in the Churchill area. They're exploring their element. They're coming in, seeing, visiting who's there, who's made their trip back to Churchill already. So interactions can begin right away between bears meeting each other for the first time since maybe the previous November when they headed out on the ice, or maybe even with some of the polar rovers and the drivers and guides and travelers that have been there in the past. It's a good opportunity. They start moving to the area and they start exploring and figuring out who's hanging out there as well. Now, when they get back, what is there to do? Well, there's not much food. When they arrive in Churchill in October, there's not much for ice on the bay. So their best bet is to find cool places to hang out, conserve their energy. So a lot of their time spent resting. This is a bear just sleeping on one of the frozen lakes or resting on one of the frozen lakes right out where we do our polar bear viewing. Again, not much food, so your best bet is to take it easy. And so stay cool. You're very well adapted for cold weather. Well, take it easy, conserve your energy until the ice starts to form. Along with that, This is also a good opportunity since they become tolerant of people. As long as we behave appropriately, we maneuver the polar rovers in a safe way for everybody and the bears. This is when they tend to relax, and you start getting these behaviors that, you know, you could travel all over the world and in just a short couple of days see more behaviors in Churchill than you would all over if you spent the rest of your life traveling around the northern hemisphere where you have polar bears. And you could get all these behaviors just in a short period of time right around the Churchill area, whether it's just relaxing, casual bears, to some of these more dramatic behaviors that haven't been observed really in any other place but in Churchill. Why maybe? Well, there's no resource to fight over. Also, we have a large collection of bears, so maybe the best way to make a go at it is just learn from each other, learn some new moves, how to wrestle, maybe size each other up, establish a pecking order. It all might be important for those early those bears before they head out on the ice, so that way they can avoid confrontation when the time comes around out hunting seals out on the frozen Hudson Bay. So this is also a good time to observe what's been happening in the breeding population over the past year. Moms are bringing maybe their small cubs in for the first time. This is a young cub of the year which came in with their mom, checking people out, learning some of those important behaviors as a bear, learning from mom where to be, what to eat, our polar rover something to be afraid of. And this is how bears become accustomed to polar bear watching very quickly, by learning from their moms who probably learned from their moms. So all these traditions are passed on from one bear to the next. And Churchill is a great place to see that happening. Now let's talk about Churchill and safety. I think anytime I take people to Churchill and spend time with people in Churchill, safety is always one of our first concerns. And I pointed out on the map that Churchill sitting on that peninsula, bears do make their way into town on occasion. In this particular case, this is a little lodge. It used to be across the Churchill River out of the polar bear safety zone. So they had to actually cover that building in bars like you see here to keep bears from breaking into it and getting into it and causing a bit of a commotion, you can imagine. Now, since then, I have to say this particular lodge is long since burned down. It was a kind of missed that experience, but it goes to show that we still do have to be safe when we're around bear country. Buildings outside of town have to take extra precautions. While inside of town, travelers and people staying in hotels and walking around the community have to observe precautions as well. You can see that they have polar bear warning signs up around the community, a perimeter that they police 24/7 during the polar bear season, where natural resources officers are always out on guard and trying to keep the community from being safe from bears, as well as keeping bears from getting in trouble wandering into town. So if you see these signs around the community, it's an actual sign. It's not a tourist. It's not set up just for people to look at, photograph, and then walk beyond. Seriously, if you walk beyond signs like this, you do enter in the polar bear's realm, and you do have a much better chance of coming in face to face with a polar bear, which could be a very dangerous situation. So the town is policed 24/7 by natural resource officers in the Polar Bear Alert Program. People who see polar bears in town are urged very quickly to call the 675 BEAR number. That way you can let them know where you saw the bear. Natural resources officers come out, they try to chase them out of town so they're less likely to get in trouble, or maybe more importantly, people are less likely to get in trouble with polar bears. So let's go ahead and move on. Polar bears do come into town, and if they can't for some reason chase them out, they might get captured and taken to a polar bear holding facility, which we used to call the polar bear jail. I don't think we're allowed to say that anymore because it's not as PC, and they're worried about the bears having issues with that if we talk about the polar bear jail. Here we have a mother and cub. They're actually being released. You can see they're in a net, they're tranquilized, and they'll be flown out of town where they're less likely to get into trouble. So give you an idea how they're flown out. Larger cubs are also put in the net, not with mother, but in a separate net, and smaller cubs would be flown actually right inside the helicopter. So they'll be flown out of town, probably 35, 40 miles. That way, they'll be allowed to wait for the ice to form on the Hudson Bay, and when it forms, they can go out on the ice and start hunting seals, where if they do this, they're less likely to come back into town and be captured and have to be put into the polar bear holding facility. So every bear that gets handled gets tagged, and research gets taken from it. Very important in understanding what happens in the Churchill area. Now, that's how we get a lot of our basic science and biology established from these bears. The ones that get handled, we take valuable data from that, or natural resource takes valuable data from that. And then once the bay freezes over, like in this situation, even the slightest little bit of ice starts to form, the bears start heading out and testing it and hopefully getting out so they can start hunting again, start working, making their living out on that frozen Hudson Bay. Here's just a picture of a bear that's testing the ice early on. Bears that are in polar bear holding facility are often just taken out, they're caged up, taken out to the edge of the ice. They open up the cage and they chase the bears on the ice with the idea that they'll head out, start hunting seals, and they won't come back into town until the next year when the season rolls around to September, October, and they start making their way back to wait for the ice to form. So there are other animals you could possibly see in this ecosystem around Churchill. Since we have this Arctic body of water so far south, we have these Arctic influences. We also see caribou in the area. Quite frankly, the trips that run in October are more likely to see the caribou as they migrate through the area. There's also Arctic fox, which every year it's a little bit different, the mix of these different players in this ecosystem, but oftentimes we can see Arctic foxes in the same environment that we watch the polar bears in, or close cousins to theirs. The red fox are also seen oftentimes in the Churchill area, sometimes just right downtown, running from street to street in the early morning hours or late in the day. Along with that, it's a good place for the potential with good keen eye, watching the snowbanks or up in the rocks along the Hudson Bay. Look for these guys, Arctic hares. One of my favorites to test my eyes and try to spot, because usually the only thing that shows up, maybe the little dark spot on the tips of the ears or the dark eyes. And then, of course, ptarmigan and a few other birds. If you like Arctic species, summertime's the best for seeing a lot of the birds, but as winter comes on, we still do have a few birds still hanging on to add to your list of birds you might be looking for in the Arctic. And probably one of my favorite birds to watch and enjoy and learn from is the raven, the common raven, which is the large black bird we find all over town and out on the tundra, always sharing new stories with me, and so allows me opportunities to share new stories with people as well. So let's go ahead and talk about a couple other things we might see in the area. Churchill sits in a pretty unique area. It sits underneath one of the most active areas for the aurora borealis. Now, I'll be upfront and close and personal with you and tell you that, your chances of seeing the aurora borealis in the fall, which is October, November, we're doing the polar bear trips, I'd say about 1 in 10 people or 1 in every 10 trips sees the northern lights, mainly because the atmospheric conditions don't allow for good, clear nights like this. In the fall, we tend to have cloud cover because of the open water and the warmer conditions on the landscape. We tend to have more fog and cloud cover, so you tend to see the aurora much less. If you were going for aurora, I would tell you to go to Churchill in January, February, and maybe even early March for better opportunities when the skies tend to be clearer. But you still do have a chance to see aurora during the polar bear season, but I would never tell somebody to go to Churchill for aurora at that time of year. It's polar bear season, and that's a good time to go for polar bears. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about Churchill and the travel opportunities. And let's see, I think Ashton's going to come on a little bit more and talk about maybe some of the bookings and details associated with that. But I'll just talk a little bit more about some of the types of trips that we offer to Churchill. We have a couple of trips which are classic trips where you stay in the town of Churchill, and then you venture out for the day out on the tundra in the polar rovers, like we talked about, and spend 2 days out there and then an evening out on the tundra. And so you're staying in town at night, comfortable hotel rooms, eating in different restaurants, experiencing the northern culture of the community. But we also have a couple of lodge trips where you actually go out and stay on this little, what's almost like a little motel built out on the tundra on these large tires, just like the polar rovers. The hotel stays there in one spot, or the lodge, the tundra lodge stays there in one spot, and then the group goes out and makes forays around on the polar rover, exploring the tundra, and that's your base of operations. We do a couple of trips out there and that are associated with just general natural history and polar bear watching, but we also do a couple of photo trips as well. It's a great place for people who really want to experience that. And this year, so much that we've actually included some itineraries where people can stay on the lodge for a few nights and then go into town for a few nights as well, so to break it up a little bit. So we have the lodge-based trips, our classic trips where you stay in town, but we also have ultimate Churchill trips. Ultimate Churchill trips incorporate about everything you could want to experience in the north at any given time. You stay in town at the comfortable hotels and lodging around town, experiencing different restaurants, but it gives you opportunities for maybe a chance to fly out by helicopter and visit a polar bear den. There are no polar bears in it, and it's a vacated den, but explore what a polar bear den would look like. Maybe if you want to, poke your head inside and give it a look. But you get to see this amazing landscape by air as you cruise over it by helicopter. The trip also incorporates dog sledding, where you can get a chance to go out and do talk to a dog sledder, learn a little bit about what it's like, and then even take a little short sled dog ride with them. And whether they run on sleds or on carts depends on the conditions at the time, because sometimes with climate being the way it is, sometimes we don't get snow until a little bit later in the season. So some years, if there is enough snow for sleds, they do make adjustments by having the dogs hooked up to carts, and you get a chance to experience what dog sledding is from the level of the cart instead of the sled at that point. And that would be an ultimate Churchill trip. So again, all these different opportunities provide for great chances to get out and experience the polar bears in their world. What's nice about booking a trip with expedition trips is the information you'll get. Helps get you prepared for this. Everything from learning how to dress for the North. So layering is one of the things we like to talk about. Dressing like an onion. I won't go too much into that, but I like to point out that one of the things we provide on the ground when you get into Winnipeg before the trip actually begins, you head up to Churchill, we provide Arctic parkas and heavy boots. We realize that some people come from areas where they wouldn't need heavy clothing like this, and it can be a difficult thing to travel with. So we try to make it as convenient as possible by providing, we have a whole set of loaner winter parkas and Arctic parkas and winter boots or Arctic boots for people to get outfitted with before going to Churchill. So you show up in Winnipeg, and we basically take care of you from there in that regard. So a big part of this type of travel is getting you prepared both in information but also in gear. And so we realize that's very important as well. So also a nice thing about it is we've learned over the years the best way to travel from Winnipeg is by charter flight. And so that's what we do. Instead of relying on local carriers and being subjected to schedules like that, we do run our own charter flights up. And you can see it's quite comfortable, plenty of room for gear, soft gear up above, stuff underneath your seats. So there's no, coming with your luggage, it's going to be on board. You don't have to worry about that getting lost or set aside somewhere. All that's taken care of by our staff. And it's about the smoothest and most reliable operation you could ever enjoy while traveling in the North. And hopefully some of the people here have had some of those experiences, and some of the positive experiences, not some of the negative ones. So with that, I'll start rounding things up for you and tell you a little bit about what we talked about so far. As I introduced you to the polar bears and how and where they live. Then we talked about the polar bear experience offered by Churchill, and there's everything from accommodations to why the polar bears are there. And then we talked a little bit about the insights into the travel experiences that are offered by expedition trips for this chance to go up and see the polar bears in their world on that western Hudson Bay region. So with that, and I'll let Ashton talk to in a minute about that, but I think he's got together a special packet for people who attended this webinar. It's a polar bear pack or an Arctic pack that has a lot of the different things you would need, like one of the coveted thing here in the Arctic pack, or the wool gloves. They have a little flip-off fingers, or flip-off finger covers, so you can take pictures or video, and then when your fingers get cold, just put it right back over. I know in my experience over the years, those have been very valuable to travelers going to Churchill, so that's part of that little package that he's put together for you. So with that, let me go ahead and round things up and tell you that, thank you guys for the opportunity to do this webinar for you and talk to you a little bit more about the polar bear experience. And also, I got to remember to thank the polar bear for giving me this opportunity to learn about its ecosystem, learn about the Churchill area and its people from its opportunity, from my opportunities to go there and spend time with them. And thank you guys for giving me this opportunity to share the polar bear experience with you. So with that, I think we're going to open this up to questions for both Ashton and myself. And so while we're doing that, I'll go ahead and go back to this page and let it, Lee, if you want to go ahead and open up things for questions.
Absolutely. And Ashton, did you have anything you wanted to add before we move into questions?
Well, just to certainly take a moment to say thank you, Eric, for the great information, great photos. And, I've traveled up to Churchill myself personally and done these trips. And, I just want to reiterate that I really do think this is a great way to not only see the polar bears, but certainly to get some great pictures as well. I've also traveled to other places and seen polar bears from ships and different other parts of the world. And this is a great way to do it. So I think, as you suggested, now is a great time if anyone has any questions. That's what we're here for, and certainly be happy to answer any. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Hey, it's a great way to celebrate, what is this, our 8 years now working together, isn't it?
Gosh, I'd say it's at least that, yes. Very, very happy to be working together, and time and time again, people just really enjoy these trips, and have nothing but good things to say about the guides and everything else too. So, yeah.
Well, good. Okay. Well, I'd like to remind our audience members on how to ask a question. So, if you have a question you would like to ask, you can do that right now by sending in your questions into the question box, and you can access that by clicking on the orange rectangle with the white arrow. It will be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Once that's open, you'll see the area called questions. So several of our audience members did find that, and I will go ahead and start in with the questions. This one, Eric, probably our most frequently asked question: when's the best time to see the maximum number of polar bears?
Oh, there's so much variation from year to year. I like to be as open as possible, because what can happen is an early freeze-up year, if I tell you one thing and things freeze up and we have less bears around towards the latter part of the season. Likewise, I've seen very warm years where bears are there right off the bat. So what I usually tell people, like anywhere you go, whether you're doing a safari in Africa or you're going to Antarctica, with Churchill, look at the overall season and then figure it's kind of set up so things might be like a spread out bell-shaped curve. We don't want to take anybody there when it isn't worth going, so we tend to schedule our trips when we know bears are in town and they're going to be in town up to a certain point. So look at that bell-shaped curve, realizing that, early on there'll be bears there, and the population will increase as you go towards the middle of the season, and figure that sometimes it drops off a little bit quicker, but usually it drops off at a fairly steep bell-shaped curve on the far end too. So anytime we're doing trips, we're setting those trips up because we know that there are going to be bears there. So, but if you look at it like, okay, if this is a bell-shaped curve, and I want to look at the total number of bears visiting there from year to year, your best bet is going to be, looking towards the center of that bell-shaped curve if you want to.
Okay. And, thinking about our seasons, I'm sure that maybe they're adjusted slightly when you refer to summer versus winter for polar bears. So what would you really consider the summer seasons for polar bears versus winter?
Well, that's a good question. We don't really do many, even though we do trips in the summertime, maybe for beluga whales in Churchill, when there's any given time there could be 3,000 of the white beluga whales hanging in the mouth of the Churchill River or in the bay there. Your chances of seeing a polar bear, they're there, but we don't really sell the trip on that. There's a good chance you're going to see them, but maybe only a bear or two if you're lucky, and it can be a little bit more difficult to get to at that time of the year. So really, we only build the polar bear season around that October, November. So we're usually starting right for the middle of October, running to a little over the middle of November. That ensures that the bears that are going to be in the Churchill area are there, and we're trying not to run too late that the ice forms and most of the bears move out onto the ice and head out and start hunting.
Okay.
Well, really, October, November is the best.
Oh, good. Okay. For photography enthusiasts, I would imagine this is a great destination, and I think about all the equipment that they might want to bring. Are there ample charging locations and support for those that are avid photographers?
Absolutely. Even out on the Tundra Lodge, we have power strips. We don't run the generator all night long. The only constraint I would ever see in this would be at night on the lodge. We don't run the generator all night. So there is power from batteries that are charged up during the day for the rooms and everything. But during the day, you can charge from power strips in the main lodge or in the main lounge on the Tundra Lodge. But around town, absolutely no problem. One of the things, a little photo trip, I do a lot of the photo trips, and one of my little things I share with people when on photo trips with me is anytime you're traveling nowadays, carry a little power.
Oops, I think we just lost Eric for a moment. Ashton, I'm going to bring you back in while we're waiting to see if we can get Eric back.
Definitely, I'm here.
Okay.
What I would say, can we mute that or something? Is that?
Let me see if I can mute him. Hold on, let's see. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, no, just to reiterate what Eric was saying, definitely the other thing that I recommend photographers do, or people that are interested in photography, is bring an extra battery or two. It's not a big financial investment, but just having, sometimes when you're in the cold weather, batteries can be run down a little bit more quickly, and there's so many great photo opportunities to be had on these trips that certainly if you have at least one extra battery, or even two, if you know you're going to be using your camera a lot. And one other thing to say about cameras is I strongly recommend if you are going to purchase a new camera when you do a trip like this, or you go to Antarctica or any of these trips, buy it as far ahead of the trip as you can and learn how to use it, because you don't want to be in this amazing opportunity to have great photography and not know how to use your equipment. So anyway, do we have additional questions, Lee?
One last question, and it's about packing tips. And I know that we had this great graphic that Eric shared with us, but maybe you could give us a few more tips about how best to pack to make, smartest use of what you've got available as far as packing space goes.
Definitely.
Sorry, I lost you guys for a minute. I hope I didn't miss out anything.
No, Eric. I just talked a little bit more about photography and the equipment and having extra batteries, which I think is helpful. But we just had additional question about perhaps going into just a bit more detail on some of the best gear to pack for clothing. So do you want to touch on that?
Oh yeah, I put that little kind of cartoon slide in there about layering. We're pretty casual in the North. You don't have to worry about fancy attire. I've had people show up to breakfast in, well, I'll say a little bit more than their long underwear in some cases. But layering is very important, starting out with a good microfiber layer, say like polypropylene underwear, sport underwear, something like that keeps moisture away from your skin, and then building up in heavier layers to a good wind protection. What's nice about, again, traveling with us, we provide the heavy Arctic parkas, but, a pair of wind pants or some waterproof pants can help keep the wind off your legs if you like spending a lot of time outside, or if you're doing one of the ultimate Churchill trips. That can be nice because you're out on the ground a little bit more often, or if you choose to go dog sledding. Those things are important. So think about layering like an onion, starting with a good base layer and then building up. If you get too warm, and they keep the hotels, they keep the lodges in Churchill very, very warm, you come in and you peel off those layers. And nobody would have a problem with you coming down to breakfast with, maybe a pair of shell pants on and just your thermal shirt. It's not a very formal place. It's very casual. Also, good hat goes a long way. Good warm hat. It helps insulate your head where you tend to radiate a lot of heat. Hat is very important. And I prefer mittens over gloves because your fingers work to keep each other warm if you have them in a mitten, or if they're in gloves, they're separated. And then even underneath mittens, I might wear a little light silk or polypropylene liner. That way, if I need to take a picture, I can slip my glove off, or in like the case of those polar pack gloves, mitts, just pull off the fingers, and I can work my cameras and dials on a video camera or SLR, and everything's easy to deal with. So the best thing I can say is layer, layer, layer.
Yeah. I agree, and obviously just a couple more things I'd add there is make sure having a hat that covers your ears is really great, because obviously they can get cold. And one of the most invaluable pieces of clothing that I never go to the Arctic or the Antarctic without is a neck gaiter, which is just like a scarf or something that you can pull over your head that keeps the wind off your neck. And I just always find that's very inexpensive, but a really great thing to have.
Absolutely. Good idea.
Yeah, good point. So, there's questions here about whether November would be at the top of the bell curve, as you were talking about, best time to see polar bears. And so is that, would you say that's the case then?
It varies a little bit from season to season, but that bell tends to, the peak of that bell tends to be, a week before to a week after Halloween. But, unseasonable weather can throw that off. We've had freeze up early. If you went too late in November, I've seen freeze up happen, and only ever once in 15 years it happened really early, and the bears left. Now what happened is it was so unseasonably early that the ice broke up and the bears came back ashore. at the very end of the season. So again, with the way the conditions are and the climatic conditions and what happens right now, anything's possible. But again, if you're looking at that, if you were to look at a regular bell-shaped curve, the very peak of that would be somewhere between that last week of October and the first week in November. And there can be very little drop-off some years. It's more like if you could imagine the peak, the bears all showing up in Churchill, and if there's one or two less bears that haven't made it there yet or left early, even I wouldn't notice that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Eric there. It's I generally recommend people aim for the middle of the season to have the best opportunity. But we are dealing with nature and wildlife, and you can only guarantee so much. But so I would say aim for the middle of the season.
Good. Well, that brings me to my last question, which was actually about the dates that you have available for this trip, Ashton.
Well, yeah, I'd be happy to share that information with you. I do have all the availability here, and I still see availability right around the time that Eric was mentioning, last week of October, October 31st, and then or 29th and 31st of October, the very first week of November, there are still departures available, and also even the 6th and the 7th of November. So there's still good availability. These trips are filling up, though, as more and more people decide to do this trip this year. And with all the different media attention on the Arctic and all the different issues that are surrounding this area, we're seeing more and more interest in travel to the Arctic. And so if it is a destination that is on your list and something that you'd like to see, I'd encourage you to go.
Excellent. Well, this has been great, and we have a few questions that I'll forward along to you, Ashton, for some personal follow-up, but I think now I'll turn it back over to you and to Eric for anything else you'd like to share before we go.
Well, I don't really have anything else to say except once again to everyone, thank you for joining us today. I am truly passionate about this style of travel, and I love to help people, and we really enjoy doing these presentations. Once again, thank you to Eric for your time and passion, and of course Lee, to you for helping us host this as well.
Great, thank you. My thanks as well. We certainly appreciate having all of you here with us, and with that, we will say good day and conclude our webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thanks so much.